Hello, brothers and sisters in the Lord Jesus Christ. Welcome to this video. I have not made a video in some time, and I've been waiting for that right time, which is now. Before we get into the political crisis which is consuming Israel's government right now, and before we talk about draft laws and coalition arithmetic and budget deadlines, I want to start somewhere else entirely. And those of you who are on this channel will know about the man I'm going to talk about. This man died 20 years ago. He was a man who spoke rarely. He published nothing, and he left behind 3 statements that are looking more and more remarkable with each passing week. These statements were recorded by his students, as he never wrote anything except for the note which he left, which I'm going to cover as a summary. His name was Rabbi Kaduri, and this presentation is about what he saw and why the next 42 days matter more than most people realize. Who was this man, and why should we care what he said? Yitzhak Kaduri was born in Baghdad around 1900, and he lived to be somewhere between 103 and 108 years of age. The records from Ottoman-era Iraq were not always precise, but what is certain is that he moved to Jerusalem in 1935 and spent the rest of his extraordinary life as the leading Sephardi kabbalist of his generation. The numbers on the left tell part of the story. Born around 1900, he moved to Jerusalem in 1934 as the leading Sephardi kabbalist. He died on January 28, 2006, aged somewhere between 103 and 108. At this funeral, more than 200,000 people lined the streets of Jerusalem. The city was effectively shut down. Now look at the 3 cards on the right, because these matter for understanding why his words were taken so seriously. First, he was a kabbalist of extraordinary reputation. He reportedly had a photographic memory of the entire Talmud. He wrote nothing publicly his entire lifetime, not a single published work. Every spoken word he uttered was recorded by his disciples as though it might be significant. He was revered across all of Israeli society, not just within his own community, and chief rabbis sought his counsel. Prime ministers visited his study, and Ashkenazi, Sephardi, and secular religious people across the full spectrum of Israeli life treated him as a spiritual authority. Third, and because this is relevant shortly, he personally knew Benjamin Netanyahu. In 1996, at a political rally, Netanyahu whispered something in Kaduri's ear. Kaduri raised his hand and gave him a public blessing. Kaduri's endorsement is widely credited with helping Netanyahu win that election, as he had many followers. The man at the center of today's political crisis stood in Kaduri's presence and received his blessing. Remember, he spoke rarely, he published nothing, and every word was treated as prophecy. The quote at the bottom of the slide is key to everything that follows. When a man like this speaks, you pay attention. First, prophecy, elections but no government. When you hear what he said, and when you understand the context in which he said it, you will understand why his disciples were confused for decades, and why, starting in 2019, they suddenly were not. Rabbi Kaduri was once asked directly, "When will the Messiah come? What will be the sign?" And he answered in 7 words, "When there will be elections, but there will not be a government." And obviously that was in Hebrew. And why no one understood it was at the time, and for decades afterwards, nobody knew what to do with that answer. How can there be elections without a government? That is a logical impossibility. You hold elections, somebody wins, a coalition forms, a government is sworn in, and that's simply how the parliamentary democracy works. One of his disciples who heard it, Rabbi Merav, recalled the confusion vividly. He said, I'm paraphrasing it slightly, "It seemed contradictory. How could there be elections but no government? If there are elections, there will be a government. That's simply the way things work." No one understood at the time, but this is really how it is with prophecy. You don't understand it until it happens. Then came 2019 and 2020, and suddenly everybody understood it. Israel held 3 elections in 18 months, in April 2019, September 2019, and March 2020, and not once could a stable government be formed. The deadlock was unprecedented in Israeli history, and for the first time in Israel's existence, there were elections, but there was no government. 40 years after Kaduri spoke those words, they had come true exactly as he described. But here we are, on March the 31st, 2026 is what we are watching right now. The Netanyahu government, which eventually emerged from that deadlock, is on the verge of collapse over a new crisis. This is the greatest and most important crisis since the reformation of the State of Israel in 1948. The Haredi ultra-Orthodox draft crisis. This, if the budget does not pass, all three Knesset readings by March the 31st, the Knesset automatically dissolved. More elections, another period without no functioning government, and the gate may be falling a third time. Rabbi Fish, a prominent rabbinical commentator in Israel today, took Kaduri's prophecy and placed it alongside an ancient Talmudic text from the tractate Sanhedrin 78a. In that passage, the disciples of Rabbi Yossi ben Kizma asked, "When will the Messiah appear?" And this is closely related with the scripture which is in Ezekiel 21:27. When this gate will fall, be rebuilt and fall again, be rebuilt again and fall again, before it can be rebuilt for the third time, the Messiah will appear. And in Ezekiel 21 we see, "I will overturn it, and it shall be no more until he come whose right it is, and I will give it him." In Hebrew, sha'ar means gate, the literal word for gate or entrance, but sha'ar also carries a secondary meaning, which is the government, the leadership, and authority. It is used in this dual sense in the book of Deuteronomy and elsewhere in the Torah. So when Rabbi Kizma spoke of the gate that falls and is rebuilt and falls again, he was speaking in the understanding of Rabbi Fish about the government of Israel, and that gate is the government, and the gate must fall 3 times. So, where are we in that count? Fall 1 and rebuild was 2019. 3 elections eventually and a coalition formed. The gate was rebuilt. Fall 2 and rebuild was 2020 and 2021. Further deadlock. Another coalition, the gate rebuilt again. And fall 3 potentially is March the 31st, 2026. The budget crisis, the possible collapse, the gate may fall for the third time. I am not saying this will happen. I'm saying this is what the ancient texts describe, and we are 42 days from finding out. And I will shortly cover in great detail why I believe the Haredi issue is going to collapse the government. There does not seem to be a resolution to what is coming. And prophecy number 2, Yom Kippur 2005, the holiest day of the Jewish calendar, and 45 minutes, Rabbi Kaduri was somewhere else entirely. The quote at the top of the slide tells you everything you need to know about what Kaduri declared, and at the time below, it shows you how it unfolded. The Messiah will appear to Israel after the death of Ariel Sharon. In October the 12th, 2005, Yom Kippur, Rabbi Kaduri was in a prayer with his disciples when he fell into a trance for 45 minutes. Those present recorded that he appeared to be in a different state entirely, and when he emerged, he told them that the Messiah appeared to him in a vision. He said that the Messiah had given his name, and that the Messiah would reveal himself to Israel after the death of Ariel Sharon. At the time of this declaration, Ariel Sharon was Prime Minister of Israel. He was in robust political health. He had just formed a new party, Kadima, and was expected to win the next election comfortably. Nobody imagined he was about to disappear from public life. December 18 of the same year, 6 weeks later, after Rabbi Kaduri's vision, Prime Minister Sharon suffered a catastrophic stroke. He collapsed, he never regained consciousness, and he was removed to hospital and placed in intensive care. 6 weeks after Kaduri had named him, Sharon was in a coma. On January 28, 2006, 24 days after Sharon's stroke, Rabbi Kaduri himself died. He was somewhere between 103 and 108 years of age, and Jerusalem shut down before his funeral. But before he died, he did something extraordinary. He had written a message on a piece of paper, sealed it in an envelope, and given his disciples strict instructions. Do not open this until 1 full year after I am gone. He told them it contained the name of the Messiah, written in code in kabbalistic tradition of hidden acrostics. But that is prophecy 3. We will come to it. In January 11, 2014, Sharon dies, and so the sign is fulfilled. Ariel Sharon remained in his coma for 8 years. The Kaduri sign remained in suspension. And then on January 11th, 2014, Sharon dies. The sign Kaduri named had been fulfilled, and across the prophetic world, Jewish and Christian alike, people returned to the sealed note. In 2026, we are watching and we are waiting as the political crisis is unfolding right now, involving the very same ultra-Orthodox Jewish community that Kaduri himself came from. And this may be a part of the picture that he was describing. Prophecy number 3 was the sealed note. I've released a video showing the authenticity of the note. The very handwriting is exactly the same as another note that he left on his site. So before Rabbi Kaduri died, he did something that no rabbi in living memory had done. He wrote a message on a piece of paper. He sealed it and he gave it to his disciples, and he told them, 1 year after I am gone, you may open it, and it contains the name of the Messiah. And in January 2007, when they opened that note, inside was a message in Hebrew. It was an acrostic message, and as you can see, if you look at the parchment on the left-hand side, the sentence reads in Hebrew and in English, "He will lift the people and confirm that his word and his Torah are standing." He will lift the people, so that lifting of the people will confirm that his word and his Torah are standing. Now, for those of you who are waiting for the rapture of the church, that is a remarkable acrostic which spells out the name of Yeshua. Those letters, the first letters put together, spell the name of Yeshua. And here's the extraordinary part. The note was published on Kaduri's own official website, kaduri.net, by his own disciples, the men who received it directly from his hands. They vouched for its authenticity and they distributed it to the public. And then it was quietly removed. The Israeli press, which is not shy about controversial stories, largely refused to cover it. Kaduri's own son denied that the note was authentic, and the yeshiva where his father had taught disputed the decoding, and the story was effectively buried in Israel. But 2 of Kaduri's personal followers later spake to the publication, Israel's Today magazine, and they confirmed plainly the note is authentic. We have no idea how the rabbi got to his name of Messiah. Christians are not saying this. Outsiders are not saying this. These are his own Orthodox Jewish disciples. And as I've mentioned, we've compared the handwriting to another note which he wrote, and you will see that the handwriting is identical to the other note on his website. Now look at the table on this slide, and when you see it, what I'm about to show you, we are not making this up. The dates are not in dispute. They are on the calendar. Tuesday, March the 31st, the Israeli budget deadline. If the government has not passed the state budget through all 3 required Knesset readings by the end of this day, the Knesset automatically dissolves. Under Israeli law, this is mechanical and non-negotiable. That is tomorrow's crisis, and it involves the Haredi ultra-Orthodox community. The very community Kaduri came from, that revered him, that guarded his teachings. They are the reasons the government may fall. On Wednesday, April the 1st, at sundown, Passover begins. The 15th of Nisan on the Hebrew calendar, the festival of redemption, the feast that commemorates the moment God delivered his people from slavery in Egypt, and the night when the angel of death passed over the houses marked with blood. The prototype in Scripture of all future deliverance, and what theologians call a type and shadow of redemption itself. The government falls on a Tuesday. Passover begins at sundown the very next day. The remaining dates are on the table for reference. Passover runs through April the 8th in Israel and April the 9th in the diaspora, but the moment that matters is the gap between March 31st and April the 1st. One day the government falls. Passover begins. The government falls on Tuesday. Passover begins sundown the very next day. Now I'm going to go over the Haredi situation in Israel in great detail, and you will see why there is a very, very likely chance that the government is about to fall on the 31st of March. There doesn't seem to be any resolution to what is coming. What you're looking at is the story of how a small, humane gesture made in 1948, an exemption for roughly 400 young men to study religious texts rather than fight, grew into a 76-year legal and political time bomb that is now, as we speak in February 2026, threatening to blow apart the Israeli government. What I'd like you to think about as we go through this is 3 words: works-based salvation. Those of us who are in the body of Christ understand the meaning of works-based salvation. However, what we are looking at now, these Haredi ultra-Orthodox do not understand that they are reliant upon works-based salvation. And wouldn't that be fitting that that very thing, the religious in Israel are going to bring the government down? The works-based salvation of Judaism is what brings the Israeli government down. You will notice the deadline in the top right, again March the 31st, 26. It's a hard statutory clock. That clock is now running with 42 days left, and the path to passing that budget runs directly through one of the most explosive, if not the most explosive, religious and military disputes in Israeli history. By the end of this presentation, I hope you will fully understand the arc of how Israel got here, from its founding in 1948 right through to the political crisis of today, and you will understand why so many believe that the current government may not survive it. Before we go back to 1948, we need 30 seconds on how Israeli democracy actually works, because the mechanics of the crisis depend entirely upon understanding it. Israel's parliament is called the Knesset, and it has 120 seats. No single party has ever won a majority on its own in Israeli history, not once. That means every single government Israel has ever had has been a coalition, which is a group of parties that agree to work together, pooling their seats to reach a majority. God has determined that the Israeli government would always be formed by a coalition, a working of people together. To pass anything, that is laws and budgets or appointments, the Prime Minister needs at least 61 votes. Now, 61 out of 120 sounds like a comfortable margin, but here's the key insight. Every single party in that coalition knows that it is essential. A party with just 7 or 8 seats can walk out at any moment and bring the whole government down. And that gives even tiny parties an enormous leverage. They can and routinely do demand specific policies, laws, or appointments in exchange for staying in the coalition and maintaining the government's security. This is not a quirk or a bug. It's the fundamental structural feature of Israeli coalition politics, and it's exactly what's happening right now with the ultra-Orthodox or Haredi parties. It is a budgetary trap. Here is where it gets politically sharp. Israeli law contains an unusually strict provision. If the state budget does not complete all 3 Knesset readings by March the 31st, the end of the fiscal year, the Knesset automatically dissolves. There is no override, there is no extension or emergency mechanism. If the budget fails, elections are triggered immediately. And as we will see, 2 ultra-Orthodox parties, that is, Shas and United Torah Judaism, currently hold exactly that leverage, and they are using it openly and deliberately. The original seeds of conflict. We go back to the very beginning, 1948. The State of Israel has just been declared, and the decisions made in those first desperate weeks have consequences that are still detonating today. David Ben-Gurion, Israel's founding prime minister, in May 14, 1948, the State of Israel is 3 days old. It is simultaneously fighting for its survival against 5 Arab armies. Ben-Gurion is trying to build a functioning state, a government, an army, a civil servant, from almost nothing, while the country is at war. He needs political support from every quarter, including from the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community. The Haredi world, deeply religious, deeply traditional, is suspicious of this new secular Zionist state. They still are. Ben-Gurion needs them on board. And so he makes a deal. He agrees to exempt a small number of yeshiva students, men engaged fully in religious study, full-time and exempt from military service. The reasoning was genuine. The Holocaust had just murdered 6 million Jews. Haredi communities in Poland, Hungary, Lithuania, all across Europe were almost entirely destroyed. Their scholars, their rabbis, their students wiped out. The argument was that Israel needed to rebuild that world of Jewish learning and that it was a sacred obligation. Here is what made the deal seem reasonable at the time. There were only 400 young men. In a country fighting for its life with tens of thousands under arms, 400 religious students seemed like an entirely manageable and compassionate exception. But there was no sunset clause, no point at which the exemption would expire or be reviewed, no cap on numbers, no limit on how many students could benefit, no enforcement mechanism. It was an open-ended political concession dressed as a humanitarian gesture. The bar chart you are now looking at tells us the story of what happened next. For nearly 3 decades, the numbers grew. Slowly at first, then faster. By 1977, around 8,000 men were benefiting from the exemption. Then Menachem Begin won the Israeli election. Begin was from the political right, that is the Likud party, and he needed the ultra-Orthodox parties in his coalition. Their price was to remove all limits on the exemption entirely, no cap at all. Any Haredi man who was enrolled in future time religious study could defer military service indefinitely. As you can see what happened. 8,000 becomes 25,000 by 1990, 55,000 by 2010, and over 80,000 today. That is the bar on the right, that massive red column. 80,000 men of military age who are eligible to serve and are not serving. Now, consider what that means for everyone else. Every non-Haredi Jewish Israeli man serves a mandatory 2 to 3 years of military service when he turns 18. Then, 4 years or even decades after, he serves annual reserve duty, being called back from his job, his family, his life, to put on a uniform. And these are not ceremonial duties. These are combat and combat support roles, especially since October the 7th attack. And this is key. And the reservists watch 80,000 Haredi men of the same age doing none of it. Legally, permanently exempt. That resentment has been building quietly for 50 years, but after October the 7th, it stopped being quiet. The Supreme Court of Israel, which has been watching this exemption grow for decades, has finally lost its patience. Not once, not twice, but 4 times. In 1998 came the first warning. The Supreme Court issues its first serious ruling on the exemption. It does not strike it down, not yet, but it sends a very clear signal. These exemptions need proper legal basis. The Knesset must legislate them properly or the court will eventually be forced to act. This was a warning shot. The Knesset responds by passing what becomes known as the Tal Law, a law specifically designed to codify and regulate the exemptions. And that Tal Law in 2025 was struck down. The Supreme Court rules unanimously that the Tal Law itself is unconstitutional. It violates the principles of equality, and you cannot, the court says, have a law that permanently exempts one group of citizens from an obligation that falls on everyone else. The Knesset scrambles to find a replacement. In 2017, that legal basis collapses. Legislation also fails legal scrutiny. The court strikes it down again. The exemptions now have no legal basis whatsoever. They exist in a kind of legal limbo, still being practiced but with no valid law underpinning them. In June 2024, this was the final blow. This is the decisive moment when the Supreme Court, all 15 justices, ruled unanimously and issued its most sweeping ruling yet. Blanket exemptions for ultra-Orthodox yeshiva students are illegal. Full stop. Not just poorly designed, not just in need of revision, illegal. The court orders the state to immediately stop funding yeshivas whose students are evading the draft. Game over in legal terms. The ruling is the gun that is now pointed at the government. Everything that follows, the draft bill, the budget crisis, the constitutional standoff, follows from this 2024 ruling. And we now get to something that many people outside Israel have not fully absorbed yet, that the government has not complied with the Supreme Court's ruling, not in June 2024 and not in November 2025 either. There was another ruling, and not now as we speak. And let me take you through that timeline. In June 2024, as mentioned, the court rules that the state must stop funding yeshivas whose draft-age students are evading service. The government, which depends on Haredi parties for its majority, does not implement the ruling. It continues to look for a legislative workaround and ignores the court. In November 2025, the court issues a further order. It sets a specific deadline by which the government must formulate and present an effective enforcement policy. This is a concrete deadline, and the deadline passes, and the government presents nothing. That deadline was January the 4th, 2026. And on that date, the Deputy Attorney General of Israel, one of the most senior legal officials in the country, stands up in a cabinet meeting and tells his ministers on record, this constitutes a violation of the Supreme Court ruling, and this is a constitutional crisis. He's not using that phrase rhetorically, he's making a formal legal statement. And today, the government's official position is that its policy is to pass the draft law, and this is what they are trying to do. But as we will see in a moment, that law does not yet exist in an agreed form, and so the court is continuing to be openly defied by the government. And why is this so serious? Why does it matter so much? Because Israel has no written constitution. Unlike the United States or Germany or France, Israel governs without a formal constitution. The Supreme Court is therefore the primary institutional check on government and power. It is the main mechanism for preventing any government from acting arbitrarily or illegally. And when a government refuses to implement the Supreme Court rulings, it is not just bending a rule, it is attacking the architecture of democratic accountability itself. Israel's democratic allies, the United States and the European Union, are watching closely because judicial independence is one of the core criteria by which democratic societies are measured. Critics put it more bluntly that the government is allowing one religious minority to operate above the law while every other citizen remains legally bound. And here the story takes an entirely different emotional register. On October the 7th, 2023, Hamas launched the deadliest single-day attack on the Jewish people since the Holocaust. The subsequent war has placed Israeli society under the most intense, sustained military pressure it has faced since 1973. And in that context, the question of who serves and who does not becomes impossible to ignore. Following June 2024, the Supreme Court ruling, the Israeli IDF began doing something it has not done systematically for decades, sending formal draft notices to Haredi men aged 18 to 26 who had been deferring indefinitely. These are real letters arriving at doors, when the men ignore them, as many do, there are real consequences. Men who fail to report to induction centers are being arrested, sometimes even at home. Sometimes the arrests happen at the induction centers themselves, where ultra-Orthodox crowds gather to physically block recruits from entering, and police deploy water cannons to clear the way. Beyond arrests, the government has cut financial benefits from yeshivas, the religious academies whose students are evading the draft. Daycare subsidies, scholarship grants, institutional funding, all reduced for non-compliant institutions, and some draft evaders have also had their passports flagged, restricting international travel. And enforcement appears to be working to a degree. Already enlistment rates doubled in 2024 compared to the previous years, but the overall number is still small, just a few thousand. But the direction is meaningful. The enforcement creates compliance. The ultra-Orthodox community's response has been fierce. Mass protests have blocked major roads in Jerusalem at Bnei Brak, that is the heartland of the Haredi Israel near Tel Aviv, and Tel Aviv itself. Water cannons have been deployed. In February 26, just days ago, a Haredi mob in Bnei Brak physically attacked 2 female IDF soldiers, and police had to intervene. The rabbinical leadership has been equally uncompromising. Rabbi Dov Lando, one of the most senior spiritual figures in Degel HaTorah faction, declared publicly in January 2026, and I quote, "Not a single yeshiva student will go to the army, whether the authorities agree to it or not." And so the gap, that is 12,000 are needed for the military, 80,000 are eligible and absent. This is the military dimension of that crisis. Into this environment, a Supreme Court ruling being defied, arrests and induction centers, mobs attacking soldiers, an IDF short of 12,000 recruits, the coalition is trying to pass a law. This is called the Bismuth Law, named after Boaz Bismuth, the Likud member of Knesset who chairs the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee and has drafted it. It is, depending on your perspective, either a pragmatic compromise or an insult to everyone who serves. What the law actually says, let me be very concrete about what it proposes, because the details matter enormously. Full-time yeshiva students continue to be exempt from service indefinitely. There is no end date, no mandatory transition to civilian work. If you're studying in a yeshiva, you do not serve. Second, and this is the one that generates real fury, every Haredi man who is currently being prosecuted for draft evasion gets full amnesty, criminal records wiped clean. Men who spent the past year ignoring legal notices and court orders face no consequences. And third, the funding that was cut off from yeshivas after the 2024 ruling is restored immediately. Before a single recruit has set foot on a military base, the money flows again. Fourth, anyone who reaches the age of 26 without having served is permanently exempt from any enforcement. The state simply stops pursuing them. And fifth, the enrollment targets, the numbers of Haredi men who are supposed to eventually join the military are set deliberately low, and an oversight committee retains power to lower them further if circumstances are deemed insufficient. And sixth, the only sanction for missing targets is a travel ban, and for a community that largely lives locally and rarely travels internationally, this is, as critics have pointed out, essentially toothless. And why are secular Israelis so furious? Now, you understand that a significant portion of the religious Zionist community regard this law as a moral catastrophe. The core grievance is simple: inequality in blood. Secular men serve, fight, and in over 1,000 cases since October 2023, they die. Haredi men are legally exempt. This law makes that gap permanent. The amnesty provision is perhaps the most inflammatory element. A secular Israeli man who dodges the draft goes to military prison. A Haredi man who does precisely the same thing for an entire year openly with the backing of his community gets amnesty and has his benefits restored. Same country, different laws for two sets of people. The Israeli Democracy Institute, a respected non-partisan research body, has stated that the bill's enrollment targets represent a, quote, tiny percentage of eligible men and do nothing to address the IDF's actual security need. The Knesset's own legal advisor, Miri Frankel-Shaw, has gone even further. She has warned that the bill contains, quote, fundamental legal flaws, including a clause allowing the Oversight Committee to lower draft targets, which she says would be unconstitutional. She has called for the bill to be a temporary measure of no more than 5 years. And here is the situation as of this week. Frankel-Shaw, who was being pressured by the coalition to produce a revised draft by the end of last weekend, she has not even begun writing it yet. And we have 42 days. The draft bill and the national budget have become inseparable. The Haredi parties have made it simple. The explicit announcement is no draft law, no budget votes, and without their votes, the budget cannot pass. Who holds the power? And these are the parties explained. Likud currently has 32 seats. Likud is Israel's main center party, and it holds 32 seats, by far the largest bloc. Obviously, Benjamin Netanyahu is its leader, but 32 out of 120 is nowhere near a majority. That's why he needs his coalition to stay loyal. Shas is the Sephardi ultra-Orthodox party representing Haredi Jews of Middle East heritage. 11 seats led by Ariel Sharon, one of the most experienced political operators in Israeli history, who has been in and out of government and prison for corruption multiple times. Shas has stated publicly and unambiguously, "We will not vote for the government. We will not vote for the final budget readings unless the draft exemption law passes." 11 votes, critical. United Torah Judaism is actually two factions that run together. Degel HaTorah, led by Moshe Gafni, and spiritually guided by Rabbi Dov Lando, and Agudat Yisrael, led by Yitzhak Goldknopf. 8 seats between them, but crucially they have already split. Degel HaTorah voted yes on the budget's first reading as a tactical move to keep his options open, but Agudat Yisrael's 3 MKs voted against it. Both factions, however, say that the draft law must pass before they support final readings. Critical. And here is the wild card. Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich leads the Religious Zionist Party, which is a nationalistic settler-supporting and far to the right. 7 seats. Smotrich is actually opposed to the Bismuth Law in its current form, not because he wants Haredim to serve, but because he believes passing a law that secular Israelis see as profoundly unjust will cost the political right enormously at the next election. He was recorded at a closed meeting warning that the right will, quote, collapse electorally if the law goes through. And so what we see here is Netanyahu is simultaneously managing Haredi parties who will collapse the government if the law does not pass, and a coalition ally, the Religious Zionist Party, who thinks it will destroy them electorally if it does. So you can see the complication as it stands at the moment. The 2026 state budget totals approximately 812 billion new Israeli shekels, roughly $262 billion. Israeli law requires a budget to pass through 3 separate Knesset readings with a minimum of 60 days between first and final readings. This is important because once you know when the first reading has happened, you can calculate the earliest possible date for the final one. And so, January the 29th, the budget passes its first reading, 62 votes to 55, a narrow win. Shas and Degel HaTorah vote yes as a tactical gesture buying time. Agudat Yisrael's 3 MKs voted no. Both Haredi parties make their position explicitly. They were voting yes for the first reading only, second and third readings depending specifically on the draft law. On February the 8th, behind-the-scenes negotiations between coalition officials and the legal advisors stall completely. United Torah Judaism source tells the Times of Israel there is no advancement, there is nowhere to go. That was just on February the 8th. And on February the 9th and 10th, the companion arrangements laws, which governs how funds are actually distributed, passes a key committee vote, 60 to 56, another near revolt. The coalition had to split the legislation into 2 pieces just to get it this far. On February the 15th, a Haredi mob attacks 2 female IDF soldiers in Bnei Barak. The incident dominates Israeli news. Secular public opinion hardens sharply against any deal that could be seen as rewarding the ultra-Orthodox community. And on February the 16th, that is a couple of days ago, as of this presentation, the coalition is pressing Mary Frankel-Shaw, the legal advisor to the Knesset, to produce a revised draft of the bill, and she has not begun writing it. March the 31st is the wall. The 60-day gap between the first and the final readings means the earliest possible date for the final vote is already very tight. Time is not running out. Time is nearly gone. And this slide makes the mechanism completely explicit. Here is how the government falls, step by step. Step 1. The Bismuth Law cannot be finalized. The legal advisor has identified fundamental constitutional flaws. The revised text has not been written. The clock is ticking. Shas and United Torah Judaism have both stated publicly no draft law, no budget votes. This is not a negotiating position they are keeping private. It's their explicit announced state. 3. Without the Haredi votes, Netanyahu cannot reach 61. The second and third readings of the budget fail in the Knesset plenum. And step 4, the Israeli law is mechanical. No one needs to call a confidence vote. No one to formally bring down the government. If the budget has not passed all 3 readings by March the 31st, the Knesset dissolves automatically. This is what the law says, and there is no human decision at this step. It happens. And snap elections must be held within 90 days of dissolution, and most analysts expect them in June or September, depending on the time of dissolution. And Netanyahu's government, the most right-wing coalition in history, comes to an end. On Channel 12 News in Israel, one of the country's most respected broadcast outlets, reported on February the 10th that there is growing understanding among the Haredi legislators themselves that the draft bill will not pass. And given that the draft law was one of the primary reasons the Haredi parties joined this coalition in the first place, they are increasingly likely to collapse the government out of frustration rather than accept an outcome as they see a broken promise. And this is the reckoning. We are at the end of the saga's arc, and the question now is, which way does it break? There are 3 possible outcomes. First, the scenario is that a deal is somehow reached. This is a low probability. The legal advisor produces a revised bill. Negotiations between Bismuth, the Haredi parties, and the coalition succeed, and the bill passes the committee. It advances through the Knesset, and the Haredi parties honor their end and vote for the final budget readings. This is the outcome Netanyahu is working towards. The revised text, though, does not exist, and a 60-day gap is legally required between the first and final budget readings. The mathematics of the calendar are extremely tight, and the legal advisor has fundamental objections that go beyond cosmetic changes. Scenario 2 is that the government collapses. This is the high probability. This is the most likely scenario, according to most analysts and according to Channel 12's reporting from inside Haredi caucuses, is collapse. The draft bill stalls or is rejected. Haredi parties withhold their votes on the final budget. The budget fails. The Knesset auto-dissolves. Snap elections are called for June or September. This would end Netanyahu's government and likely his political career. It would almost certainly trigger a significant realignment of Israeli politics. The composition of the next Knesset and government is genuinely uncertain. And scenario number 3 is another deferral, which has medium probability. Netanyahu is one of the most experienced political survivors in Israeli history. He's faced a crisis of this nature before, including in June 25, when the same standoff appeared to be heading for dissolution and was resolved at the last moment through a combination of deals, concessions, and creative political maneuvering. It is possible that he finds a way to defer the crisis again. However, given the position of the Supreme Court and the government now in defiance of their legal declarations, it is unlikely that this will happen. There is no emergency mechanism. If votes are not there, the clock runs out and the Knesset is gone. Netanyahu has fewer escape routes this time than he has had in the past. And this story matters beyond immediate political drama for 4 deep reasons. The first is the most visceral, the question of who sacrifices and who doesn't. 76 years of unequal burden sharing has reached breaking point. The social contract at the heart of Israeli society is the implicit agreement that citizens share in the defense of the state. Soldiers have died, families have been torn apart by years of reserve duty, and all alongside this, 80,000 men have been legally exempt. The question of this is whether it is sustainable, morally, socially, politically, is one Israel can no longer defend. We have the constitutional crisis, we have the economic risk, and we have the end of the Netanyahu era. When we began this presentation with a small act of compassion, 400 young men in a devastated post-Holocaust world exempted from military service so they could rebuild a tradition nearly extinguished by history. It was a humane decision made in a genuinely terrible moment. No one in 1948 imagined that exemption would grow 200-fold. No one designed it to be a permanent open-ended entitlement for tens of thousands. No one built in the mechanisms to manage its growth, and 76 years later Israel is living with the consequences of those omissions. But what we also have to remember is that the way that secular man thinks is not the way that God thinks. I'm torn between this because I see things from the secular perspective where they should share in the duties to protect Israel, and also the fact that their works-based salvation is what is preventing them from bearing arms and protecting their homeland. But then on the other perspective, I also see that God ensured that the Levites were set apart. He didn't give them any land, and his statutes and his laws were that the children of Levi were to be a children that were set apart from the rest of Israel, and the rest of Israel would give to the Levites and the priests. So I see this from both perspectives, and I don't really have a clear side myself. So what do you think about this? Do you think that they should continue to be allowed to study Torah, and that the problem is secular Israel's unbelief? Perhaps they should trust in God and allow the study of Torah. Or is it that the Haredi men should have faith in the Lord and not rely on works-based salvation? So certainly they can have faith and they can protect their homeland by bearing arms and ensuring that Israel is not destroyed. I'm sort of caught between those two thoughts. I'd really be interested to know what yours are. So why don't you leave a comment below the video describing your opinion on this matter. I love you very much, and I'll see you in the sky.